Data protection and privacy teams are under more pressure than ever with new laws, AI oversight, data breaches, and the constant expectation to do more with fewer resources.
That's why TrustArc built a modern privacy and data protection management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. It unifies your tools, automates the work that slows you down, and surfaces what matters most right when you need it.
From guided quick actions to our intelligent assistant, Ask Arc, you get credible, contextual answers backed by expert research, not generic AI guesses.
Finally, privacy that works the way privacy pros work.
Learn how TrustArc helps teams move faster with confidence at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.
You're listening to Serious Privacy by TrustArc. Please welcome our hosts, Paul Breitbarth and Kay Royal.
From my childhood, I recall this big feeling of anticipation towards the end of the year. My birthday, St. Nicholas, Christmas, all good things would come within 1 month of each other. A great time with new gifts every other week. And it's a bit the same feeling I'm having this month. You can hardly breathe before new privacy and data protection updates see the light. Not even 3 weeks ago, we saw the final versions of the standard contractual clauses. Next, an unexpected privacy law in Colorado. More about that in next week's episode. And this week, we have the long-awaited updated recommendations from the European Data Protection Board on possible supplementary data transfer measures, as well as a clear call on a ban for facial recognition in public spaces. We'll leave facial rec for a future episode as well, because today we'll focus on international transfers again and what we can learn from the EDPB recommendations. My name is Paul Breitbarth.
And I'm Kay Royal, and welcome to Serious Privacy. Well, as y'all expected, as soon as the guidance came out, Paul and I are getting together to record a podcast for you. We gave it an extra day just to make sure that we could read it, understand it, the nuances, any of the ways that it impacts the standard contractual clauses, the other things we have. So we are ready to rumble today.
We are.
Unexpected question, Paul.
Give it to me.
What's your favorite gadget?
Yeah, it has to be my phone.
Unfortunately, I'm right with you.
If you rule out the phone, then I'll probably choose my AirPods Pro without making any kind of commercial recommendations. But these are some of the best earphones I've had with the noise cancelling in them and no cords so I don't get stuck every time everywhere. They work pretty well.
Nice. I love it. If I was to answer right now, I would say it is my Samsung smartwatch because it does the EKG on it. And when I went to the physician and I made a mention of it's just a smartwatch, I get it. She's like, actually, they're pretty good. And I know Apple came out with it a while back.
Yeah, my watch does the same.
Sorry, people. I'm not a big Apple user.
I'm not a Samsung user.
I love the fact that they use privacy as a differentiating factor. Maybe one day they'll sway me back over. I even had an iPad at one time. Still not a big fan.
Yeah, you should see my office right now.
Oh, you're nothing but Apple everywhere. Apple should start sponsoring Paul. Samsung should start sponsoring me, and we're just going to have these smartphone battles as they go. All right, let's jump in.
And of course, I'll win.
Shut up, dude. I'm going to leave that in for the heck of it. Okay, let's start talking about the recommendations that came out from the board. I mean, historically, both the SCCs and the recommendations came out last November. Looking for comments, it was the drafts, and there were a lot of comments. There were a lot of thoughts because they seem to directly contradict each other. We were hoping, when they come back out, that we would see something different. What's your thoughts?
We certainly do see something different. I was actually expecting a bit of a fight going forward.
Okay, be honest, you were hoping for it.
Maybe a little bit, if only because that will bring data protection more into the news, and that in the end is good for all of us.
Yeah, it would be completely different for Europe to have that. So I agree with you.
At the same time, I think the European Data Protection Board has taken a sensible approach. The fundamentals of the guidance have not really changed, but there is sufficient change to also accommodate everyone from the business community, including ourselves, who have said, you are too strict and you need some kind of risk-based approach in combination with documentation requirements to make this work. Because otherwise, what you basically do is prohibit data transfers to certain countries because there is no way you can get data out of the European Union. And that is, I think, the main change that they have made. The risk-based approach is somewhat, they provide more detail on how to do your assessment, especially your third country risk assessments. They give really great specifications on some of the technical measures that are envisaged, and there are no longer scenarios where the board rules out upfront that supplementary measures are impossible to implement. And I think also that is a good step forward.
Okay.
So where do you want me to start?
Let's start.
Or shall I just ask you to explain everything?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Dive in, ask me. I have memorized every word of this guidance. Not. I do find that the European guidance tends to be quite lengthy and quite detailed. And a lot of people I've heard, say, good Lord, can't they just get to the point? Well, they do. If you look at some of the bigger guidance that comes from regulatory agents here in the U.S., you look at some that come from other countries, they're the same way. Anytime you're trying to explain guidance on a huge regulatory issue, it's going to be long, it's going to be detailed, and it's that way for a purpose. It takes that to get the point across.
And basically every sentence has a reason why it's there. And I mean, ask on the other end, Europeans to take a look at US legislation, and it's like building a Lego castle with only half of the set that is available to you.
Oh, well, because we try to get straight to the point. I'm rolling my eyes if you can't hear that on the podcast. Okay. So let's talk about that. Let's go to the most important thing first. So
the risk-based approach.
Do what?
The risk-based approach.
I was going to say no. I was going to say, does it directly contradict the standard contractual clauses that came out?
Okay. No, it doesn't actually. It supplements the standard contractual clauses, even though there is one question where we are still in suspense.
I think we'll remain in suspense.
For a little while at least. In general, they really complement the SCCs, and you see from the document that the European Commission and the European Data Protection Board have cooperated well in developing both the new SCCs and the new transfer recommendations. If you recall from the SCC, a large part of the new SCCs, the whole section 3 from top of mind, so that is clauses 14 and onwards, so 14, 15, and also 16, mainly 14 and 15, they deal with the Schrems fallout. So they deal with the third country risk assessments, with identifying what could be appropriate supplementary measures if the standard contractual clauses do not suffice to uphold an essentially equivalent level of data protection. And that is exactly what the European Board has written about. How do you assess your transfers to find out if third country legislation is problematic, as it has been called, and what should you put in place, what could you put in place in order to maintain that essentially equivalent level of data protection?
Yes, and that's the main point, period, of all of this, is that personal data coming out of Europe needs to be protected.
Yes.
And
you cannot undermine the level of protection by transferring it to a third country.
Right. And not that anyone tries to deliberately undermine the protection, but given the massive surveillance laws, and yes, I know the Schrems II decision essentially, well, it did. It called out two specific U.S. ones, an executive order and under the FISA. But there are many countries that have pervasive surveillance laws in place, the United Kingdom being one of them. And so the guidance, the SCCs, the court decisions, GDPR, all of them are centered around protecting the personal data and the rights and interests of the individuals.
Yeah, I'm not sure the UK is the best example to mention at the moment.
Ooh, okay,
we are
hush.
Still hearing about UK adequacy, which seems a bit unfair to some of the other countries. But yes, the essentially equivalent level of data protection needs to be offered. And to do that, you need to make assessments. Case-by-case basis, that was already clear from the court decision. So for every data transmission from the European Union to a third country, whether that is controller to controller or controller to processor or processor to processor, you need to do these assessments. And they need to be based, according to the EDPB, on information from public sources that needs to be relevant, objective, reliable, and verifiable. So you cannot just make assumptions and say, oh no, but my gut feeling says that I won't be targeted by this and this surveillance law.
Right.
Of course, you first need to find out what are those surveillance laws. So you need to make an overview of those. And then you need to assess the impact of those surveillance laws to you as a company and to the specific data transfers at hand. And then you need to see, is that a real impact? Before, the board said you cannot take into account the likelihood, you cannot take into account any practical application, because sometimes countries have legislation that is not applied in practice. That has changed. So you are allowed to take into account the practice also of government access and surveillance laws.
So you can take advantage of the fact that we've never been presented with.
Yes, but just that statement is not enough, because results from the past are not a guarantee for the future. So if that is the case, then yes, you can use that as one of your arguments. But you also need to be able to rely upon similar statements from the same industry or the same sector, maybe other public statements that are available, messages from oversight bodies for the surveillance services that would also be able to supplement all that information.
I like it. So let's dive into the risk-based approach then. So what do companies need to do to make sure that SCCs work, to make sure they're protecting the data, to make sure they're following the...
So, first of all, you need to do that data transfer risk assessment or data transfer impact assessment, as some call it as well. And that's 6 steps that the board already outlined in the draft opinion from November, and they haven't changed. So you need to know your transfers, that is updating your processing activities register. You need to identify which is the transfer mechanism that is most suitable for what you are dealing with. Could that be adequacy? Could that be using appropriate safeguards? Or could that be using, in very specific cases, some of the derogations? If you are using the so-called appropriate safeguards, so then we are in Article 46 of the GDPR, you have a choice. You can use the standard contractual clauses, you can use binding corporate rules, the ad hoc clauses, certifications, or code of conduct. The latter 2 have not been approved for transfers yet.
But we're getting there.
So basically, we're getting there. Give it another year at least. But we have SCCs, BCRs, or ad hoc clauses. Most companies will choose SCC because they are the easy option between parentheses, because then you don't need to go through a regulator anymore. Once you have completed the contract and now also completed all the annexes, then you can use it. You don't have to go back to a regulator, whereas BCRs and ad hoc clauses, you always need to get regulator approval. Then you need to take a look at whether or not you need appropriate safeguards, so supplementary measures to be put in place. And to be able to do that, you need to take a look at the full set of legislation of the third country, so the country of destination. In your example, that would be the US, where the data are flowing to, as well as the international commitments of that country. So if they have signed a human rights treaty, especially related to data protection, like Council of Europe Convention 108+, that would go a long way in providing assurances on the practices of that country.
Now, didn't I hear something about when it comes to assessing the practices of the other country, I mean, you have to assess the information that's publicly available.
Yes, so
you may not have any insight into what's not easily found.
No, so in case of the US, you can take a look at all the government representations that have been made around the time of the Snowden revelations, around the time of the adoption of the Privacy Shield, the oversight reports from the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, reports from the Privacy and Civil Liberties, any case law that is available, all those kind of elements can be included in your assessments. And then when you have done your assessments and come to the conclusion, okay, we can work with supplementary measures, you might be able to put those in place. And then depending on the scenario you've chosen, you may also need to get that DPA approval, mainly for BCRs and ad hoc clauses. And of course, like with all accountability measures, you need a regular review and update of your impact assessment. So back to those supplementary measures, can we actually use those? Well, that depends on your answer to the question, do you want to use them actually? Because that is new. That is recital 47 of the clauses, or paragraph 47, I probably should say, of the EDPB recommendations. And it gives you 3 options. If you come to the conclusion, based on your third country risk assessment, that there is so-called problematic legislation, option 1 is to suspend the transfer, which would always guarantee that you are GDPR compliant because you would not be undermining the GDPR by putting the data at risk. Or you could continue the data transfer, but only on the basis of supplementary measures that are agreed by the parties involved in the processing operation. So both the data exporter in the European Union and the data importer in the non-EU. Or you could, and this is really new, you could continue the data transfer without putting in place any supplementary measures, because the data exporter, so the European company, considers there is no real risk the negative impact of the problematic legislation will actually occur. And I have the gut feeling that a lot of companies will say, oh yeah, we've done an assessment and we come to the conclusion that it's option 3, so we're going to continue and we're not going to bother about supplementary measures. Well, just saying that, unfortunately, is not enough. Because if you want that option, you need to have a full report outlining all your considerations, all your assessments, what you have done, how you have done it. It also needs to include your internal process for the third country risk assessments. It needs to include the references to the public sources that you have been using to come to this conclusion. So you can only do it if you can really substantiate your conclusion, oh no, we are not at risk, with hard evidence. And also here the board says assumptions about the potential events and risk do not suffice. And by the way, you also still need to make sure that the data is encrypted, both in transit and at rest.
Right, which the good thing is, I know they had previously given the impression that encryption wouldn't be enough. And maybe they're still saying essentially that encryption is not enough in and of itself.
They still say that encryption is not enough.
But they do give a list of supplementary measures that they recommend, which is 1, not an exhaustive list, and 2, isn't mandatory.
True, because in the end, it is the responsibility of the data exporter and the data importer to together come up with the supplementary measures that they consider to be relevant and required. Encryption is on that list, and it is pretty clear from the document that without encryption, it's almost a no-go. Both in transit and at rest, you need strong encryption. And there are detailed specifications on what that entails in paragraph 90 of the recommendations. So they give a full list of what you need to assess, and that includes trustworthy public key certification authority or infrastructure. It includes state-of-the-art measures against active and passive attacks. The encryption algorithm and its parameterization confirmed to state-of-the-art can be considered to be robust against crypt analysis performed by public authorities. The strength of the encryption needs to take into account a specific time period during which the confidentiality of the encrypted personal data must be preserved, etc., etc. All in all, there are 8 bullets which identify about a dozen criteria that you need to take into account. If you are using encryption, then at least it needs to meet those standards for international transfers.
Right, and these supplementary measures start on, I'm looking at what page they are. They start in Annex 2, which is page 28. And they give you use cases when they're looking at it. So you can look at particular use cases that might apply to you and what exact circumstances that you're under and be able to determine if these safeguards work for you or if they don't work for you. As we said, they're not mandatory, but they are a good suggestion of what the authorities would consider good supplementary measures to put in place. But you do need to make sure that you take into account under the circumstances of which you're putting the supplementary measures in place. And following Annex 2 of the supplementary measures, they go to Annex 3. Now, Annex 3 is possible sources of information to assess a third country. So we talked about it needed to be publicly available information, but they give you wonderful examples of things to go look at. Now, I'm going to tell you, Paul, these examples are not things that the average person in the average company are going to be able to go, well, I mean, I guess they can, but these are legal things.
But this assessment is also something you probably would want your legal team to be involved in. And the report that I was just referring to, if you are going to rely upon your gut feeling, or, well, not your gut feeling, but your assessment and say, we are not at risk, it needs sign-off from the legal representative of the data exporter. So a general counsel or somebody similar to that role. So you will want your legal team to be involved here. And that also brings us to why this is still problematic. I mean, yes, a lot of people are complaining that the use cases 6 and 7 that we also saw in November on basically cloud service providers where data needs to be provided and also remote access to personal data hosted in Europe, those have not fundamentally changed. The board has now said, well, we can imagine that you come up with things that we haven't seen, so we haven't identified any measures instead of we rule out that measures can be taken. But in principle, the use cases have not changed. So that is a challenge in itself. But the bigger problem here, you've heard me explain all the steps that you need to take for every single data transfer that is to a non-adequate country. And that means that lots of resources are required. And even while companies that are part of the big tech family, that some of those companies have big legal teams that might be able to do this analysis, most of our economy still is based on SMEs, on small and mid-sized companies that would not be able to do all this work and also do not have the money to outsource it to outside counsel. And I think people have rightfully pointed out that it is pretty unfair that the European Commission and the regulators put this burden on the shoulders of the individual companies instead of taking some of it themselves. In a Twitter conversation, somebody mentioned that I suppose the real question is why the European Commission has done the kind of analysis it has the scale in cloud to do itself onto SMEs struggling to navigate this. It will be a costly endeavor for some, and I would say it will be a costly endeavor for everyone, regardless of the size. And it is going to be a pretty difficult effort for anyone to complete, to document properly, including for the DPAs themselves, because also they are transferring personal data.
Right. And so it was interesting this morning to wake up to the argument going on your LinkedIn page, I believe, as well, which had to do with oh goodness, my brain's blanking on it.
The scope of application, Article 3.2 versus Chapter 5 of the GDPR.
Yes.
Is that the one that you were referring to by chance?
Yes, that might be the one that I'm referring to by chance. So talk to me about that then, because this is going to be something that companies are going to find hard to wrap their brains around, is this new idea that if the GDPR applies to the service or the product that you're offering, because you're offering it to data subjects in Europe, that you don't need a data transfer mechanism according to the standard contractual clauses that were issued last week or the week before.
The 4th of June.
Yeah, exactly. So, wow, that's been a while back now. But the fact that you don't need a data transfer mechanism under the new standard contractual clauses, does the guidance reinforce that?
The guidance doesn't mention it at all. And I had hoped, that it would be included in the guidance as well, but it seems we have to wait a little longer until the board is able to draft their opinion on the relationship between Article 3.2 and Chapter 5, which is still on their work program, but I haven't seen it yet. I haven't heard any rumors about that it's actually being written at the moment. So that is still work in progress. I am still convinced by my analysis that I also shared in our SEC's episode a few weeks ago, that the SEC document says if Article 3.2 applies, so if you are offering goods and services or targeting the behavior, monitoring the behavior of people in the European Union, then you are subject to the GDPR and you cannot use the standard contractual clauses. And I still think that this means that if you are subject to the full GDPR, then you don't need any supplementary legal framework in place to make sure that you can comply with the full GDPR, because you are already subject to it. And at the same time, I'm not convinced by my own argument, because...
This is worse than playing chess against yourself.
I know. I'm a lawyer.
Enough said.
Put 2 lawyers in a room and you have at least 3 opinions.
Exactly.
put one lawyer in a room, then you can easily have two opinions, if not three. I'm not always convinced by my own argument, because there are lots of practical obstacles as well on why this wouldn't work and why this would be really strange. Then suddenly a US company or a Chinese company would need to comply with the full GDPR, which they also might not be able or willing to do, which in itself is already a strange situation. Then again, it's not the only law with an extraterritorial scope. Think about the USA Cloud Act, which also has a clear extraterritorial scope. So I'm going back and forth on this issue, and it still seems to me that it makes sense, the argument that if the full GDPR applies, then why would you still be subject to Chapter 5? Or why would you need supplementary measures under Chapter 5? Because anything you do needs to be compliant with all the foundations of the GDPR anyway. But there is a lot of disagreement between privacy scholars on this relationship. So we are really looking at the European Data Protection Board and possibly even the Court of Justice of the European Union to give us an answer to this question. But that is indeed the debate that is also ongoing on my LinkedIn page, and we'll post it in the show with some of the bright minds on privacy here in the Netherlands. But rest assured, the discussion is in English, so you will be able to follow it. But my former colleague, Shura Nas, Uber DPO here in the Netherlands, Simon Hania, they are pretty bright minds in privacy who I have always respect their opinions, and the three of us are not in agreement on what this says. So there are so many interpretations possible with so many angles to consider. Just to give you one example, I'll keep rambling on until you stop me. Footnote 19 in the EDPB recommendations. Yes, footnote 19. Always read the footnotes, people. Is actually relevant in this whole discussion as well. And it does answer a question that we've been asking ourselves for a while. But footnote 19 says, you will not be considered a data exporter if you are a data subject providing your personal data via an online questionnaire to a controller established in a third country, so in a non-EEA country. So if you fill out a questionnaire, which could also be just a web form, for example, to register for an event or to get gated content, that would not be considered a data transfer.
Right.
And that would be something that is directly subject to the GDPR. Well, some might argue this is the household exemption. At the same time, while the household exemption would only apply to me as a data subject when I'm processing data of individuals.
Right.
But the household exemption would not apply to the recipient of that data. So if somebody fills out a web form at trustarc.com, for example, to register for our International Transfers webinar next week, then TrustArc would not be able to rely on the household exemption. There is no transfer mechanism that is being used because it is the individual themselves who are registering. So that means that the only possible outcome is that TrustArc needs to be GDPR compliant for that processing operation to protect the individual's data.
Okay. I'm not disagreeing with that.
Which is another argument in favor of the extraterritorial scope of GDPR. But it's still a struggle. There are other indications, for example, on how you deal with binding corporate rules and why, for example, has the court not come to this conclusion in the Schrems decisions? Shouldn't the court have considered 3-2? So there is a lot more thought that needs to go into this, a lot more scenario-based analysis, I would say, and I guess that's on my work program for the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and remind me, was it the court decision or was it the guidance that came out afterwards that said that the court decision about assessing the controls of the third country, of course, only applied between businesses because individuals, in the example you gave, would have the privacy notice available to them and they would be able to make an informed decision whether or not they wanted to give their information to the company outside Europe.
Yeah, that would be the guidance, and you can also still argue that could be maybe even a derogation, or I don't know. There are so many ifs and buts in this whole scenario. I'm sticking to what I've written on the TrustArc blog so far, and I encourage everybody to read it and also join the debate, because if we need to have this debate right now, and whether the board comes up with their opinion in the fall or maybe even next year, we cannot wait for that. We need to start working with those SECs after the 27th of June. So as of next week, when this podcast is released, the new SECs are applicable and we need to start working with them. So we also need to start understanding when we can and cannot use them.
Right.
And the SECs clearly stipulate that you cannot use them if the processing is subject to the GDPR directly.
Right. I mean, it's not just that you don't need them, it's the fact that they're not valid.
They're not valid. So if you are not allowed to use SECs, but
for data transfer.
Final interpretation, the transfer SECs, but the final interpretation is that you still need a transfer mechanism, then what alternatives do you have?
Right.
Not all countries have adequacy, and it will take a long time before some of the major economies will get adequacy, if they will ever get it. And BCRs and ad hoc contracts are also not a solution because of the backlogs that the DPAs currently have. So I'm not sure what the Commission is trying to do here. Well, I think I'm sure what the Commission is trying to do here.
Well, they're not trying to make it easy on us.
I don't believe that they're trying to make it easy on us, but it would be helpful if somebody just said, this is what we intended with this Recital 7, or this is what we intended with Article 3.2 of the GDPR. And let me just go on another rant here. The European Commission is the body in the European Union that is responsible to propose legislation. So they write the first draft of any legislation and probably a few drafts before that. But the first public draft comes from the European Commission. Then they go and negotiate with the European Parliament and with the European member states. And in the end, they agree on something that is published in the official journal. And from that moment onwards, the Commission says, oh yeah, but we are not here to interpret the legislation. We cannot tell you what any of the provision means because that is up to the courts and in some situations, like with GDPR, to the supervisory authorities, but that is not up to us. But they have never explained what their original intention was with some of these provisions. If you look back at the original Commission proposal from 2012, you will not find an explanation on what exactly is the relationship between Article 3.2 and Chapter 5 of the GDPR.
And that would have been something they could have included in the recitals.
I think so. I think they could have, I think they should have, and I still think that the Commission would be able to explain what their intention at the time with this provision was, and then leave it up to the DPAs to further elaborate on that, or say, well, we're gonna contradict it now because we don't like it the way that the Commission explained it, and what the negotiations in the end resulted to is something different. But the Commission is not giving us any of that information on their original thinking. And that is, to say the least, unhelpful in this situation.
It really is, because otherwise the only interpretation we have is to go by the plain meaning of the words. And
exactly.
The SCCs seem to be giving us plain meaning of the words, and the European guidance that came out does not contradict that. So it looks like we are proceeding full steam ahead under SCCs, and anyone who offers goods and services to data subjects in Europe qualify under GDPR. And that's one of the biggest things we recommend as well, is make sure that you have your documentation in place that shows that the good or service that you're offering, that's the subject of your contract, is subject to GDPR, because it applies to the processing operation or the processing activity, not necessarily the company. So yes, the company has to abide by it if the service falls under it. But what if you have 5 services? Maybe 4 of them are subject to GDPR and 1 of them is not. So you need to make sure that you go through your analysis and look at your specific processing activities and determine, does this good or service fall under Article 3.2 of GDPR? Am I offering this to data subjects in Europe? And make sure you have that documented, because controllers, or I guess not controllers, but companies in Europe may very well ask you to warrant that in your contract, that you are directly subject to GDPR. I mean, otherwise they might be liable for not validating.
Yes, I tend to agree. And let's not forget, it is not easy to be directly subject to the GDPR. That is not that is not something you easily do, or you can just stipulate or state in your contract, and then it's all fine. Also, then you need to do the work, you need to do the assessments, because in most of these situations, you will still likely need a data protection impact assessment, because if data flows abroad, then there could be a higher risk to your processing operation,
Right.
especially if it's a larger volume. And let's also not forget, you need to comply with Article 32 of the GDPR, which deals with data security. And Article 32, among other things, also explains that, yes, you need state-of-the-art security measures in place, but you need to ensure that the data cannot be tampered with. There can be no illegal access to the data. There can be nobody who changes the data. So also the security level needs to be appropriate. So it indeed pseudonymization and encryption, but also you need to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resilience of processing systems and services, which is also something that you need to assess in light of any government access.
Right.
Not only abroad, not only foreign, but also at home. And that means, in my view, that even if you are subject to GDPR and you are based in China, you still need to put in place security measures that may help you to keep the Chinese security services out of your data, or the Australians or the Americans or whatever.
Or whichever government surveillance might be there. Now, the only thing that still stands out to me is taking a risk-based approach based on the data itself. So under GDPR, the breach notification rule actually centers around whether or not the data that was compromised would impact or have a detrimental effect on the individuals.
Yeah, there needs to be a risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons in order to make it notifiable to a supervisory authority, and there needs to be a high risk to those rights and freedoms of individuals,
right,
to also report it to them directly.
So can you take that same risk-based approach to the data that is subject to the security provisions or the extra safeguards that you need to put in place? So in other words, if the only data you have is maybe an IP address, maybe
yes,
with cookies, heck, let's go there. Let's talk about cookies. Let's not. But let's say that's what you have, is the only identifier you have is an IP address, and you have zero information that you've ever been able to associate that IP address with any type of other identifier. Can you take a risk-based approach to that data?
Yes, actually. And if you look at paragraph 33 of the opinion on page 15, they allow you to take the specific circumstances of your transfer into account. So it is the purposes, it's the type of entities involved, it is the sector, it is the categories of data transferred, and also the amounts of data, where the data will be stored, the format of the data, possible onward transfer. So all of that is included.
So make sure you account for that in your DPIA that you're doing on your processing activity. And I would say companies in Europe that are looking at whether or not to put additional safeguards in place with the processor, the controller, the subprocessor, whatever, outside Europe, is also be willing to consider that. Don't have, and this is what we've seen for the past year or so, don't have a standard set of additional safeguards that you require every company to put in place. Your data categories, your data subjects, all of that is standardized across all of your contracts. That's not personalized for that activity. So it is a lot more work.
Well,
it is.
Yes, it is, but you may actually reuse the safeguards that you have implemented in one contract if the circumstances of the contract are similar or the same. So you need to do individual case-by-case assessments, but the outcome can be that the situation is the same, and thus you can use the same safeguards.
Yeah. And my concern was more over, companies who list every data subject that they process data on, or every category. And it could be that the processing activity doesn't touch your employees, or it doesn't touch your end users, or it doesn't touch minors, because this is the particular processing. So make sure that you're not using just one set of descriptions, you're actually looking at what that transfer is. And I know that's a lot of work, but if you don't do that, then the European Data Protection Board will be able to say that you clearly did not take a unique or individual approach to this processing activity. Mm-hmm. And if you can't document that, how can you possibly support that you actually did a risk assessment?
Maybe in order to go out with a bang and make everybody really scared, there is one point in the recommendations that could actually void everything that we have just said.
No!
And make any data transfer still impossible.
No!
In paragraph 30, it is mentioned that your third country risk assessment must contain elements related to government access to personal data, such as elements on whether public authorities of the third country of your importer may seek to access the data with or without the data importer's knowledge in light of legislation, practice, and reported precedents. Even if it is not your country of destination, there is legislation out there, including Executive Order 12333 from the United States, that could apply anywhere in the world to any cable-based interception.
You're not making this fun.
And with that, we'll wrap up another episode of Serious Privacy. A nice cliffhanger for you. Thank you for listening to us again. If you like our series, please do tell your friends and colleagues about us. Rate and review our episodes in your favorite podcast app or on your favorite podcast platform. Should you have any questions or suggestions, if you want to continue this debate with us.
Oh, and Serious Privacy has a LinkedIn page now, so feel free to go look for Serious Privacy on LinkedIn.
Exactly.
And we can have all kinds of debates and conversations there too.
Exactly. So join us there or reach out to us via seriousprivacy@trustarc.com, via Twitter at @podcastprivacy. You will find Kay on Twitter as Heart of Privacy and myself as EuroPolB. This was it, our special episode on the EDPB recommendations. And again, we run slightly over, so take your dog for a bit of a longer walk today.
Exercise twice as hard.
Until next week, bye.
Bye, y'all.
That was Serious Privacy.
If you're a data protection or privacy professional, you already know the pressure. Non-stop regulatory change, AI oversight, internal demands, and the expectation to somehow stay ahead of it all. And the old patchwork of tools just isn't cutting it anymore.
No. That's why TrustArc created a modern privacy management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. The TrustArc platform brings your workflows, evidence, research, tasks, and applications all together in one unified and intelligent workspace so you don't waste time digging, clicking, or context switching.
With Ask Arc, your privacy assistant, you can ask plain language questions about laws, jurisdictions, or even your own program data, and get credible, cited answers based on NIMBY research and more than 1,000 global laws. It's explainable, transparent, and purpose-built for data protection and privacy.
So if you need to add a vendor, create a cookie banner, or start an assessment, quick actions take formally complex tasks, turn them into bite-sized guided workflows to save you time.
It's a platform that thinks like you, works like you, and helps you move faster with confidence, whether you're a seasoned DPO or you're just getting started.
See how modern privacy gets done. Explore Arc at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.